Okay, so we are starting our anatomy and physiology portion of the course. And just before we begin, I want to clarify something about anatomy and physiology. In this course, we're going to be scraping the bare surface. We could spend, in fact, I do spend 2 semesters on anatomy and physiology, my course that I teach. And 2 semesters is human, but it would be the same or even longer for veterinary because there are more species to cover. So that said, realize that we're getting a pretty bare bones, minimized version of anatomy and physiology. So what exactly is anatomy and what is physiology? They go together quite well, but anatomy by itself is basically the structure of an organism or the body of the organism and how they relate to each other, whereas physiology is the function of those structures. So let's look at some statements here, which I don't expect you to understand all of the terms here, but with some description, we'll take a minute to think about which each of these statements refers to. Is it the structure, anatomy, or is it the function, physiology? So pericardium is the term for a membrane or tissue that surrounds the heart. So think about it for a moment. Do you think that's anatomy or physiology? I'm going to show you the answers to all of these in a moment. So cardiac means heart. So cardiac muscle is contractile. That means it can shorten. So the statement cardiac muscle is contractile. Think in your mind for a moment, anatomy or physiology. Number 3, the heart wall is composed of that cardiac muscle. So which is it, anatomy or physiology? The kidney filters blood. Pretty straightforward there. Urine is stored in the bladder. The bladder is lined with something called transitional epithelium. That's a type of tissue that is on the inside of the bladder and lines it. Number 7, the epidermis, that's the upper layer of the skin, is stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified squamous epithelium is a type of tissue or type of epithelial tissue. So what type of statement is that? Is that describing anatomy or physiology? And then the last one, stratified squamous epithelium is thick to provide protection. So let's look at the answers. So the blue ones, hopefully you chose those or thought of anatomy when you read the blue ones or thought about them. And then the red ones are describing something that has to do with function, so physiology. So you have a little bit of an idea of what these 2 terms mean. They really go together because there is a mantra, we'll see in a moment, that form follows function. In other words, the anatomy of something really is dictated by what its function is going to be. And so there's this whole branch of biology called comparative anatomy, where you can compare the structures of different species and see how they're the same or how they might differ. So here we can see a bird, a quadruped, looks like a dog, and then the human being. Human beings and birds being bipeds, they walk on 2 legs, versus the dog or horse or cat being a quadruped. So in color-coded or same color are similar bones in each of these individuals. So this red bone here is called the femur. And you can see that it looks pretty similar in the dog and the human. It's a little shorter in the bird because of the way that the bird uses its legs to walk. And of course, most birds anyway, fly as well. So they don't have as much weight bearing on that bone as, say, a human who's upright or a dog. The blue bones are the lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. So the tibia is the larger one, and the fibula is the smaller one. And in birds, those have been fused into one bone, so you see there's the tibia fibula kind of combined. In dogs, they are partially separate but fused towards the end. So again, it just has to do with how these bones are used and weight bearing and things like that. The green, kind of interestingly, the green bones are the bones of the foot in the human, but you can see in the bird and in the dog, those bones are much longer. Again, because of the way that these limbs are used, their physiology, the anatomy has changed. So again, there are similarities, but also differences depending on what you're looking at, what structure you're looking at. So there's that statement, form follows function. And here are two skeletons to compare, a horse versus a dog. Very, very similar, but you can see some differences. For instance, in the horse, we have some more substantial vertebrae. There's going to be much thicker vertebrae for the weight bearing of the larger animal, as well as a larger shoulder blade, or scapula it's called, versus the dog. There are also some differences in the lower leg. So for horses with the heavier weight, all of their little toe bones, or phalanges that you see here in the dog, they have fused into a single heavier phalanx that bears that weight. So once again, form follows function. So again, we'll see differences, but also similarities. Within a species, we already looked at the head shapes of dogs, and we'll look at that again to kind of reinforce that, but also across species, as we were just looking at the lower leg bones of horses and dogs. So here's our dolichobrachii and mesocephalic examples, and that's within the species, so different breeds of dogs. Here are the skulls of those dogs and how you might compare them as far as, the length of the nose is really what is different. So very long nasal passages or cavities in the dolichocephalic, very short in the brachycephalic. And these have resulted from selective breeding throughout history, as dogs were domesticated and began to be bred by humans for certain physical characteristics, so the way they looked, or maybe an ability like being able to smell better than another animal, or another type of dog. So based upon breeding and selective breeding, these different skull shapes have emerged. Here's the dog and the horse limbs a little bit more close, and on the this time on the left is the dog, and on the right is the horse. So these were the bones I was talking about, where dogs have several smaller, thinner metatarsals. There's pretty much just a single big metatarsal in the horse, with a couple of smaller ones that are almost not even existent on the side. And then these phalanges, which are like the toe bones in the horse, have reduced down to a single heavier phalanx for that weight bearing. All right, so now we have an example. So some similarities but differences, again, in the number of vertebrae. So the vertebrae are the small bones that make up the spine. And you can see that across most of our four-legged animals, so cattle, swine, sheep, horse, dogs, and cats would be included here, humans, the number of cervical, so cervical are the neck vertebrae, the number of cervical vertebrae is the same, 7. We have some differences when we get to the thoracic, so that's the back area, and these are the vertebrae that the ribs attach to. So in dogs and cats, and we'll get into skeletal specifics of the skeletal system in just a few minutes, but in dogs and cats, we have 13 of the thoracic vertebrae, just like in cattle. Pigs vary by breed, as do sheep, so some have 13, some have more. Horses have longer backs, so 18 thoracic vertebrae, and humans have one less, 12. The lumbar is the lower back, the heavy vertebrae in the lower back, and I would say 6 is the average number for most. Humans happen to have 5, but dogs and cats actually have 7, and you can see somewhere between 6 and 7 is typical. And then sacral is the last portion of the spine. This is right in the area of the, let me go back to, so right up in here would be your sacral area, and these are actually the coccygeal, which are the tail vertebrae. But the sacral vertebrae are those that are right near the pelvis. And you can see, again, it varies, and sometimes they're fused, meaning they are grown together. In humans they are. There are 3 sacral in dogs and cats, and then you can see 4 to 5 in the domestic species, domestic farm animals, I should say. Coccygeal is the last, and that varies greatly because that's basically your tail vertebrae. So depending on the animal, you might have more or fewer coccygeal vertebrae. So here's those cervical vertebrae, or the neck vertebrae. Giraffes and humans actually have the same number, 7. But look at the difference in the neck length. And that's just because the cervical vertebrae in the giraffe are much longer and larger than in the human. So it ends up giving the giraffe a much longer neck, but the heavier cervical vertebrae help to support the weight of the head and the neck. So difference in shape and size, but not in number. So it just varies. Okay, so I'm not sure if this video is going to work or not, but this is a video clip from Twilight, or one of those Twilight movies, which I thought was somewhat amusing in relation to what we are discussing here, which is the similarities amongst vertebrates. Some people dream, I guess, science fiction wise, dream that maybe this person could turn into a wolf because of the similarities, but obviously, at least not in this day and age, people do not morph into wolves, as far as I know. So let me see if the video will work. There we go. Oops. Pretty seamless there, huh? Human to wolf. So if you saw those movies, now you can maybe appreciate the silliness of that whole idea. Okay, let's move on here. Oops, sorry, we don't need to watch that again. Let's move on here to what we're going to call the levels of organization. So actually, you know what? I'm going to stop here. We'll pick up this in the next video because I'm realizing it's going a little long, and I like to keep my videos short. So we'll stop here and we'll start here in the next video.